Hey y'all, you know we're a nonprofit, right? That means we rely on donations from listeners to keep this podcast going. So if you have a couple of dollars to spare, because every dollar counts, please consider giving at patreon.com/femfreak. Also, fun fact, in addition to the perks that you'll get as a Patreon subscriber, your donations and contributions on Patreon are also tax deductible because we're a 501c3. So if you want to learn more, if you want to give, please head over to patreon.com/femfreak.
Jane Fonda could do the AMC promo video where heartbreak feels good in a place like this, but Nicole Kidman couldn't do Klute. That's what I'm getting from this conversation.
Welcome to Feminist Frequency Radio. This is the show that asks you to be critical of the media you love. I'm Anita Sarkeesian, and my co-host, Kat Spada, and I are nearing the end of our series examining Hollywood through the decades. Today, we're discussing an era where scandal plagues Washington, reproductive rights are making headlines, and the Equal Rights Amendment has yet to be federally ratified. Nope, we're not talking about 2022. We're looking back half a century to the 1970s.
Bree Daniels?
What the hell is going on here?
Are you going to take Johnny away from me?
Take a nap, because you're going to need all your energy tonight.
Silly boy.
And I am thrilled to be chatting once again with Feminist Frequency family founder Carolyn Petit, managing editor of Kotaku, and our tour guide through the decade of Mahogany, The Exorcist, Cabaret, and so many more culture-defining films. Welcome back, Carolyn.
Thank you. It's great to be here. And yeah, as you rattle off some films of the decade, I was thinking, I'm reflecting a little bit on how difficult it was for me to choose two films to focus on for this decade. But I think the two films that I picked offer an interesting cross-section of portrayals of women in the 70s and how they kind of evolved, from decades prior, how they reflected the sensibilities of the era, and so on. Yeah,
absolutely. You have big shoes to fill because almost everyone that I asked to be on this series with us wanted the 70s. Like the 70s is, like you just answered first before everyone else. And I feel like the 70s is just this like epic film period of time that people just glamorize so much.
Right. And what's kind of interesting about that, first of all, I have no business being the person to talk about the 70s, given the pedigree of folks you've had in this series. Shelley Stamp, and like you have Walter Chow, one of the great film critics of the modern era, I think, talking about the 80s. So, I am just a fan, a movie buff who happens to have this association with Feminist Frequency. But anyway, I'm thrilled to be talking about this decade because, yes, I mean, it's so well, you use the term glamorized, but part of what's so interesting about the 70s is that you have these directors, filmmakers like, of course, Scorsese and, Spielberg, Lucas, but, Scorsese, De Palma, Francis Ford Coppola, who really in a lot of ways wanted to kind of de-glamorize movies, I think, and get to something that kind of broke away from like studio gloss and like genre conventions, sort of very, focus tested or formulaic films, and do things that really focused on people in a more natural way. And I think you also see a lot of sort of suspicion of power and suspicion of like American institutions in film in the 70s. And in fact, one of the films we're talking about today, Klute, starring Jane Fonda, is considered, it's by a filmmaker named Alan Pakula. And it's the first film in what's sort of considered his loose, unofficial paranoia trilogy, it's often referred to as, and that includes, so Klute being the first film, The Parallax View, starring Warren Beatty, and then lastly, All the President's Men, which is his film starring Dustin Hoffman and Robert Redford about Watergate, and so which is obviously very much a film about a failure of like American institutions and corruption and suspicion and so
what
a
do you
really
think,
a fascinating era of
do you know what's going on in the period that has proliferated that? Like we've talked in previous episodes about how Hollywood perpetuated this mythology about American society that wasn't actually true, right?
Right.
And this feels a little bit more like pulling the weeds out from that, right? By being like, no, well, I guess pulling the weeds is not a good analogy here, but you know what I mean? Like the underbelly of like, no, this is actually more realistic to what's happening in the society potentially.
Right. And well, of course you have, the filmmakers that are kind of emerging in this era. I mean, a lot of them, they are folks who have grown up, say, with like the Vietnam War happening, for instance, right? I mean, clearly, and the civil rights movement, these things that I think galvanized a lot of like activism, a lot of challenging, authority, challenging like respected institutions. And I mean, I think that's definitely like in the, just in the mix sort of ideologically in terms of shaping like the tone, the kind of gritty tone that you get in a lot of 70s films and just the deeper, desire to kind of shake things up and not just not just have the same kind of reverence toward the status quo and the kind of patriarchal, maybe romantic happy ending to films to kind of break free of a lot of that stuff and do different and challenging things that are going to challenge an audience in some ways.
One thing that's been really interesting thinking about these movies, not as one-offs, but as part of a continuum throughout the 20th century, is how the filmmakers were, and the types of stories that were told and the audience behavior, how it was all kind of influenced by the media that came before it. And in the 70s, probably the 60s and the 70s, is when we have our first generation of filmmakers who grew up with Hollywood being a big part of their lives and culture, like they would have. When we get to An Unmarried Woman, there's a fantastic scene where we talk about some of the women's the women stars of cinema of the 40s and 50s. And then I always think of the 70s as kind of the influence of the home video generation of filmmakers that were coming into prominence when I was younger. And, now we're probably about to see, or we are seeing, the filmmakers who have come of age with the internet being like a very common presence. And with our previous guests in the series, we've had some academics talking about their what they've published and how they get into this. But I think that what has unified everyone is like you said, being a fan. So I'm curious, before we talk more specifically, like what the 70s, you could say this about every decade, but there's you could look at just the horror of the 70s. You could look at just the sort of sexual thrillers or just the big blockbuster action movies and the Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Like, what draws you? What made you want to sign up for the 1970s episode and be first?
Yeah, well, sure. And I think both of these films really illuminate this. I think it's a newfound focus on on character ahead of plot. I think you get right. I mean, I think in I love so many like film noirs of the 40s. I love so many studio films, but I think what they, in sort of, I think what a lot of the directors who broke out in the 70s were we're interested in exploring character in more complex and I would say natural or naturalistic ways than so many studio films of the decades prior. So, and I think one way that's reflected, for instance, in both of the films that we're talking about today, Klute and A Married Woman. Klute, I would say, interestingly, it has like thriller DNA. The plot has like, thriller elements to it. But when you're watching it, I don't really feel like what Pakula is trying to do is so much pull us into the machinery of the thriller and generate suspense so much as he is interested in exploring Jane Fonda's character, who among other things, gets to be explored through scenes in which she's talking to her therapist about like very complex things that she's feeling and, internally her inner life, how that's being explored and how that's being changed by what she's going through in the plot. And then, similarly in A Married Woman, you have the main character in that film also like starts going to therapy after her divorce. And that also gives, it's kind of a device that the film can then use to give these characters an excuse to really talk to us, the viewer, about like their inner lives and the ways in which the circumstances that they find themselves in are like challenging their pre-existing notions of themselves, are making them feel things that they previously didn't feel. And yeah, I really enjoy that, like that rich exploration of character that you get in these films through that device and just throughout the films more generally.
It's been a long time since I've watched any of those like Charade or the 1960s sort of caper movies. And I don't remember those as being character pieces. I remember it being like, let's get from set piece to set piece.
Yeah.
And this, Klute reminded me, well, Donald Sutherland is in it, but I had recently watched Don't Look Now, where half of the movie is sort of like a sexually explicit married couple dealing with grief.
The sex scene in that movie, the sex scene in Don't Look Now, mind-blowing.
It's really something. And like, Donald Sutherland is so, I don't know, he's so like serious. And I don't expect him to be serious for some reason. But then the other half of it is this like crime in Venice, and maybe it's supernatural. And it's like, oh yeah, this is definitely pushing boundaries that they weren't pushing. Or even like I loved that you picked kind of two different genres of movie, because we have like a romantic sort of comedy drama in An Unmarried Woman. And that also is leaps and bounds different from the types of like romantic comedies that you might have seen in the 50s and 60s. Right.
And the possibilities that it charts for its character, even like there's An Unmarried Woman is in the Criterion Collection, and the accompanying essay is by the critic Angelica Bastian. And in it, she notes that the women's, there used to be this genre that studios produced called the women's picture. And she kind of places An Unmarried Woman in a way in the tradition of the women's picture. But, the women's picture, even when it sort of celebrated for a while women being maybe more independent, women being challenged and overcoming challenges in their lives, typically the women's picture still in the end had the patriarchal, ending where like the way she really ultimately quote unquote like finds her place or finds, fulfillment is the happy ending of being paired up with a man in a monogamous, like exclusive relationship. And so I think it's so fascinating that An Unmarried Woman, the experience of being divorced opens up the main character to new kind of exciting possibilities with men. And, in the end, when offered this option to have what would clearly, I think, be a pretty exclusive relationship with this guy, this exciting man that she's met, and where her life would be kind of secondary to his, because it would be all about, his painting, like him doing his painting. And that's why he has to be in Vermont or whatever with his family. If I go 2 days without painting, I may never paint again. So his career and his ambitions are so important, and hers would be less important.
Yeah.
She opts not to go with him. And you have this final image there, therefore, of her, wandering down the streets of New York with this ridiculously huge painting that he's given her. And it's kind of like wonky and awkward, her walking down the street, but it's also like she's not, to me, there's like this exciting possibility in that. Still, the openness, the unknown, right? Her not being paired off with the guy.
I read that as he's a fucking dick leaving her with this thing.
Yeah, that's fair. That's
no,
fair,
no. I see what you mean, but I just remember being like, what a fucking mean thing to do to somebody, right? It's this priceless piece of art that she can't just abandon, but she also can't put in a cab and whatever. I think something that was interesting about that I was thinking about after I read that article from Angelica Bastien is how one of my frustrations over this series has been these films that are about women, where the women are like, where the women are like kind of cool at the beginning, right? Like I'm specifically thinking of like Roadhouse with Ida Lupino, which Kat, you and I were like, wow, Ida Lupino, like she's really cool. But they all kind of fall into this pattern at the end. Even the femme fatale energy, which I know been a lot of words written, feminists tend to really gravitate towards that. The
complicated woman.
Yeah, like it still ends up feeling a little like, they're just like giving everything up for the men, or they're just like, like there is a complicatedness, but it just doesn't feel the same as something like Unmarried Woman, right? Like there's a different energy here where like it isn't. The complication here does feel, obviously it's like more of a realistic story, but like it doesn't have this happy ending, right? It doesn't have, I guess it kind of does, but it doesn't have the like button up Americana happy ending to it, right?
Right.
It just feels very different. And even with, and Klute kind of did that, right? Klute kind of gave you that like, whatever.
It's interesting to me, like the contrast there, because in An Unmarried Woman, you have a woman who starts off in a monogamous relationship with a man, her husband, the kind of traditional, family unit. And at the end, there's maybe the liberation of her saying, no, I'm not going to go with you to Vermont. And then, and we leave her there. Whereas in Klute, you have this woman who, at the beginning, her the state in which we meet her is sleeping with lots of men and kind of, enjoying that, but not enjoying it like physically, sexually. Like she doesn't take pleasure in it in the sex as sex. She enjoys it for the control that she feels in the dynamic when she's with those men. And then she meets Klute, Donald Sutherland, this very kind of traditional kind of like corn-fed, like decent, like fundamentally decent dude. The end, it's like she's kind of being a little unclear maybe with herself and, about whether anything with him is going to last or if she's really committed to it. Because she says on the phone, like, oh, I'll probably be back in the city next week or whatever. But I feel like really she does want to, pair up with him. And therefore the ending of Klute feels more traditional in that regard and more like she's no longer that, troubled. Yeah. She's not less the quote unquote troubled woman she was before. And now maybe with this man, she has hope of being a more kind of, domestic, I guess, woman, perhaps, or something. Yeah.
Kat, you want to introduce these films since we're basically diving into them for listeners who aren't familiar with them?
Well, they'll be mimicking my experience because I feel like I had spent about the last 15 years, like when I was an intern at Universal Studios when I was in college. One of the assistants was so mad at me that I'd never seen Klute, and so he showed me scenes from it. And I still hadn't watched it until just this weekend. So I am so glad I finally have. But we watched 2 films, as we've talked about. Alan Pakula's Klute from 1971, in which Jane Fonda plays a sex worker who teams up with an investigator, played by Donald Sutherland, to search for a missing person who'd once been a client of hers. And in Paul Mazursky's 1978 film An Unmarried Woman, Jill Clayburgh stars as an Upper West Sider who navigates dating, friendships, and parenting an independent teenage daughter in the aftermath of an unexpected divorce.
I have a very important question.
Yeah.
Why the fuck is it called Klute when it's clearly so clearly
about Brie?
Like I've seen the box cover. I'm a big fan. I really like Jane Fonda. Like the more I see of her work, the more I'm like, of course she's a movie star. Like she's just so captivating. And I assumed that she was Klute, or that Klute meant something else. Like it kind of fucked with me at the beginning of the movie when it's like, Detective Klute, blah blah blah. I'm like, what the fuck? And then it doesn't even become about him, which I was appreciative of. But
I like to think of it as a sort of the Legend of Zelda type thing, where it's about it, like the title is him, even though like not to indicate that he's the most important character, but even though he's not the most important character, sort of thing. You know what I mean? It's
a fascinating choice, I think. Like, especially during this time. It's almost like we want to make a movie about a woman, but we're not allowed, so we're just going to call it Dude Central,
It does sort of, yeah.
Klute and the girl. Klute and his gal Friday.
Yeah. I did think it's interesting that the opening shot of Klute is of a little tape recorder, right? And you during the opening credits, you just hear this tape being played, and it reminded me too that another kind of a bit of a thing that's kind of a theme or through line in a lot of 70s films is this interest or this fascination with like surveillance and recording and things like that. So, I mean, if you have this film, you have Coppola's The Conversation, which in which recording and surveillance plays a huge role. It's obviously to some degree in All the President's Men with Watergate, the tapes there. In the early 80s, you have Brian De Palma's Blowout, where John Travolta is like this sound effects recording guy in the movies and happens to record record something really, really important. So I don't know. I just find that so interesting that I guess like that kind of recording technology in terms of it being something that consumers, that people could carry around with them and use, was probably fairly new at that time, I would imagine. And maybe just, I don't know.
And it's a little bit maybe inching towards the sort of the Cold War 80s paranoia also. A very important question. Do you think the Feminist Frequency account will retweet me if I make a meme that says, Mr. Policeman, I gave you all the Klutes?
Yes.
Great. I just wanted to make sure I put that on the record as a verbal promise. Okay, so you mentioned, though, not just the recording and, like, obviously Watergate, I think, is one of the biggest things, like, cultural touch points leading into the 70s. And we're not historians here, but there's something that I really identified watching both of these movies, which is, like, I wish I knew a little bit better what kind of legal independence or protections women had in the 70s. Because, like, when we were watching our movies from the 30s, a divorce was something that a man could choose. A woman could not. Like, it was very difficult for a woman to seek a divorce. And also, like, and this is, of course, how it was portrayed in cinema and not necessarily what it was in real life, but, like, sex work would have been a last resort of a desperate person. Here, like, the divorce isn't her choice, but the relationships in An Unmarried Woman that her friends talk about, they all seem to have a little bit of agency. Like, there is talk about money and she has to have a job and where she's going to live, but it's not, I was thinking, like, oh, was this still the time when could a single woman get a credit card? Like, I don't know what the rules were at the time. And obviously to see how Jane Fonda's character is portrayed in Klute, she has so much agency over her. I mean, maybe it's not perfect and we see her kind of ebb and flow with it, but her choices that she makes as a sex worker are like independent choices that she's making. She has like, you see the pimp, you see the woman that she has like worked with to get dates. You see her talk to her therapist about when she wants to take a job and when she doesn't want to take a job. And there's a lot where I was kind of just surprised to see these women having choices. I don't know.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I clearly, she is a, what would at the time be, I think, called a high class call girl, right? She has a certain, there's a certain, yes.
She's not picking up men on the sidewalk.
Right.
There's an arrangement.
Yeah. She has like a service that she calls into, or and kind of, or like a number that she calls. Just, hey, do you have anyone like a commuter for me? And it's right. There's like a certain prestige within that profession. There's like it's obviously a few tiers elevated from other
What I found kind of striking about both of these is how much mental health discussion involved. So like both of them had therapists in the 70s, which
women,
I think, which I think there's a little bit of energy of like, our parents' generation would never go to therapy, right? Like that was just a thing you wouldn't do. So that was really interesting. And then also much more so in Unmarried Woman, like specifically talking about anxiety and like depression and they and include in this one both like around loneliness and like willingness to let people in or not. Like it was just a really interesting through thread of these films.
Yeah, and I mean there's like there are so there's one line I made a note of in my notes in Klute, just because when she's talking to her therapist, just because I thought, wow, that's so the line there's one line Jane Fonda says to her therapist where she says something like, when you're used to being lonely and someone comes in and moves that around, it's sort of scary, I guess. And I just thought, what a natural sounding, like it doesn't sound like a line that a screenwriter wrote for like maximum clarity or like trying to like, it's like something that a person is actually going to say when they're like fumbling about feelings that they don't fully understand or whatever. And that's, like that's so emblematic of what I was sort of trying to get at earlier when talking about like character being prioritized over plot, right? And like I love those moments where it's just a character kind of talking in a real way about their inner life, a way that rings true, that rings authentic. And we do get so much of that in An Unmarried Woman as well, not just through the main character, but that circle of friends. Like I sort of think of that circle of friends of hers as like a proto Sex and the City thing going on there a little bit.
Yeah, and they even call them like they even get referenced as a consciousness raising group too, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah. But like one of them is, you mentioned this a minute ago, Anita, like one of them very clearly is talking about like I think manic depression, right? She talks about like the low moods are so low, but boy, do I miss the high moods, right?
And that's Kelly Bishop, who is a legend. She's the mom in Dirty Dancing.
I know. I was like, what? I know this for what? Oh my God!
And then the grandma in the Gilmore Girls.
Yes, totally.
Totally. Okay. So
I recognized her. Sorry to all the Dirty Dancing. The fact that I've seen that movie hundreds of times, I definitely was like, oh, it's the grandma in Gilmore Girls. Like that's where I went because she's so much more iconic in that, I think.
Definitely.
So this is actually, and Donald Sutherland, it took me forever to realize who he was because I was like, I know him. And like just the seeing these actors younger, right? And in these, anyways, none of that really matters, but it is interesting. Nonetheless, one thing that, in relation to the fact that I'm like, these women like are these cool, badass women. And then all of a sudden they're like, I'm in love with you. And then they're like, boring. This kind of happens in Klute, but I think the difference is because we get some of her inner monologue via her therapist, like I understand more the attraction to him. It's not just something that happens overnight, even though it kind of does. But the fact that you get those lines, right, where she's like, oh, there's something happening here that's different. It's like an exposition without being exposition in a way that like allows me as a very cynical viewer be like, okay, I guess like this random guy who like forced himself into your house and now you're like in love with him. Like you're like, okay, I see what's happening. But the other thing, so I didn't like Klute as much as I hoped I would. But I really loved a lot of parts of Unmarried Woman. Like I don't understand why Jill Clayburgh is not a household name.
Same.
Like what the fuck? She's remarkable. She just blew me away in this whole movie. But one of the things that I was thinking about is how surprised I was that a male director in the 70s captured the energy of nonstop sexism at every turn. Right? Like I wasn't really expecting that. And yes, like feminist movement is like solidly underway in the 70s at this point. But the fact that I can't remember the character's name that Jill Clayburgh plays, but
Erica,
thank you. The fact that she like has this dope relationship with her daughter, but is also navigating like this guy who assaults her in a cab that keeps being like, what? I didn't do anything wrong. And then like all these guys hitting on her and then the tension around that, like her husband being, it's just like this constant, even the painter guy, like he's kind of a dick and he's like, I'm in love with you. I will take care of you immediately. And she's like, what the fuck, man? Chill out. We just had sex.
I love the scene where her husband tells her that he is in love with another woman, because what happens is in that scene is that he starts sobbing and sputtering like a baby, and as if like which just kind of, I think, it's as if the emotional labor should then shift to Erica, like comforting him for him being in love with another woman, right? And like she doesn't do it, like to her credit. Mode. Like she like walks away and she throws up and everything. But just that, even that like the way that he tells her, it struck me as so like typical of a man, like expecting a woman, or his wife in this case, I guess, to like attend to his like emotional needs, even when like he's being like so devastating to her.
I do appreciate though seeing a man cry at something that isn't like murder, like that. I was like, whoa, that's cool. Like not to undermine, like completely agree with everything you're saying. Just want to put that little caveat of like, we don't usually see men cry and show that type of vulnerability, even if it is a little bit manipulative in this in this situation.
I mean, I believe that he genuinely didn't want to hurt his daughter and didn't want to hurt Erica, but
he still thinks he can be, somehow he can get away with being the good guy because he feels bad.
Yeah.
I really liked that this Erica's character is consistent in her like boldness and in her like humanity throughout the whole film. So like she starts really confident and she's like running around her house in her underwear. That scene where she's like, I am the ballerina, like the prima ballerina thing. I was like, what is this movie? Like, this is so fucking good. And I love that like she's like, okay, I'm devastated and I have feelings and this thing that I thought was my whole life is ending. What do I do now? And she's like, I guess I'm going to sleep with a man and see what that feels like. And like, she's kind of honest about it, right? Like she says to him, never done this before, like, cool it, buddy. And in her relationship with the painter, she's also like, she's just fiercely independent in a way that like still allows space for the flawedness and the uncertainty and the fear and the ups and downs of everything, like she yells at her daughter's boyfriend and then immediately realizes that she's just taking it out on taking out her frustration, and like I just loved all of that.
I think there's really a lot there with the relationship between Erica and her daughter Patty, who's 15, and I was really trying, I mean, this happens anytime I watch a movie where I can never tell how old people are supposed to be. So like when the painter says that he's 42, and I was like, I thought that was a 60-year-old man. But so I was kind of doing some math. I'm like, okay, this is a 15-year-old teenager. I'm guessing Erica married her husband when she was really young, like, 21, 22, in the early 60s, when she maybe was expecting to be a kind of typical Upper West Side housewife. And now she's learned from her friends, and she's even learned from her daughter, and her daughter has learned from her. Like, there was a lot of interest to me about Erica going to her therapist and talking about puberty and talking about those kinds of emotions that she's feeling again now that she's relearning how to be a single person. And her daughter tells a story about a classmate whose abortionist kissed her on the mouth after taking $200 to perform the abortion. And I'm thinking, like, I can't imagine Erica was having that kind of conversation with her own mother in the 50s.
Right.
It's really, I think then it's like seeing a person who could not have existed when she was her daughter's age. Like, she is becoming the sort of person she might never have seen as a role model when she was young. And now she is that person. It was really, I want to watch this movie again. I mean, Klute as well, but Klute did feel in some ways like I know what to expect out of this movie. Whereas with An Unmarried Woman, I was at times like, oh, this is a very grand romantic scene, or this feels very New York and cinematic. And at other times I was like, oh, yeah, it's just a lady pulling a face in front of the mirror, like a normal human being.
And I want to mention just real quick, there's a detail a throwaway detail I really love in that exchange where they talk about her daughter knows having an abortion, where I think Erica asks, like, well, how did she pay for it? $200. And she's like, well, we all chipped in. And it's like, just kind of like this little nod to like women and girls, I think all like so often kind of crowdfunding in various ways, or like supporting each other in those times of need, right? When they can't if you can't go to your parents, you can't, what are you going to do? And having that kind of support network there, I thought was a lovely little detail. And gosh, what a New York movie, as you say. I mean, both of these I think are great New York films, but that apartment, the view that they have in that apartment, like the bridge out the window in An Unmarried Woman, it's just like, and all I just love the liveliness of it in the New York, the parties, the artist parties, the Saul's like well lit artist loft. I just love all that stuff.
I noted a similarity as well, that they both eat their food out of the devices in which they cook them. The loft made me think about that. So in Klute, Brie drinks her smoothie out of her blender, and in which that I was like, cool. She's like rushing to get ready. That makes sense. Why make another dish dirty? But then in An Unmarried Woman, in that loft, she pulls up with like a pot on a pan on a towel, and they're just like eating scrambled eggs out of the pan. And I was like, interesting. Like, that's just a character development thing. Like, why would you do that? I don't know.
I think it's such a moment that just feels like this casual, this like lived in. It's like a lived in moment, like a moment where people they're not like putting on pretenses with each other. They're just. I
gotta say, that whole scene though, I was worried. So she's yelling from the kitchen, being like, how do you like your eggs?
You want
hot sauce, cheese, whatever. And I kept waiting for him to get mad at her for interrupting his art. And when he was just like, hey baby, I love you, I was like, whoa, what is this? I'm so confused. Like, I just kept waiting for the other shoe to drop.
Well, it's kind of then like Kelly Bishop trying to give her advice. She's like, there's not a lot of decent men out there. You've actually fallen for one who likes you and isn't a total asshole. Like, that's still the reality for a lot of people, is like, I should probably go for this. And she doesn't have to. Yeah. It's great.
I also was like, you can date this guy and not go to Vermont for 2 months or 5 months or whatever the fuck. Like, that is possible, but that clearly wasn't. That was like, it took me a minute to
putting pressure on, though.
Yeah.
I do like that in Klute, to kind of go back to that casual, like, she drinks her smoothie out of the blender. Like one of her ideas of like a good time or a night well spent is just like being alone in her apartment, like drinking wine and smoking pot. I'm like, yeah, okay, that's cool. I do really want to talk for a bit about the villain in Klute, just from a cinematic, like, and a visual kind of perspective, because I think that this guy, who has been, like killing women, and it's a fascinating, depiction of. I think Pakula is really wanting to emphasize his power within society. Because we see him in this office very high in, some Manhattan like high rise. But the image, it's not at all shot like a typical, office executive scene where, it's like, might be kind of warm, and you might see a desk with like, pictures like somebody's family on the desk and like whatever. There's something about the way that it's shot that I think I don't want to say it's abstract, but it's kind of minimalist and really like emphasizes like this. It's like man in suit behind big desk with like power.
And it's kind of like a high-tech office. Like he has a remote control door. It's stark in a way that I think
it's stark. You
wouldn't see that design until like American Psycho. Like it felt a little out of time and place.
Exactly. But if in an effective way, I think. I mean, it really to me emphasizes that this is a man who exists within the echelons of power. And really, like, when he does his spiel at the end, where he's like explaining to Bree, the things that he's done. It's that typical, in a way, it's all rooted in that kind of that very patriarchal thing that like women, like by turning me on in this way, women are like transgressing and like they shouldn't do that, and that's why you need to be punished effectively. It's like, even though the urges and the sexual impulses and everything are inside him, they are his, they belong to him. It is just the women who exist and who tap into those things that he hates, and that because he can't, and that he blames. Because as a man, like, I mean, it's I don't know. That's just such a. I mean, it's still a thing today. This idea sometimes of like, on campuses, well, women walk around in these clothes and it's distracting because it turns me on or whatever. Like it's right. Like fuck you, dude. Like that's your. I mean, it's that patriarchal need to kind of to control, and that men want. They want the angel and the whore, and and women pay the price for it.
I can't say
always.
That I didn't note that nobody ever wore a bra in these movies. Not because I was like, time to be super horny.
That again,
I was
that's
it was hard not to notice Jane Fonda's breasts.
It was just something where I was like, that even that I feel like. Did that kind of go away for a minute in society, that taboo or something? But you asked Anita about why Jill Clayburgh isn't a household name. I also was totally unfamiliar with her. And I saw, and it would be overly simplistic to say that this is the reason or the only reason why, but Jane Fonda won the Best Actress Oscar for Klute in 1972. And she also won in 1979 for Coming Home, beating out Jill Clayburgh, who was nominated for An Unmarried Woman. Jill Clayburgh was also nominated the next year for Starting Over, but she lost to Sally Field, who won for Norma Ray, which was a role that had initially been offered to Jill Clayburgh, but which she turned down. And it did seem to me that Clayburgh had a lot of distinct careers. She had time on Broadway. She did a lot of television movies. But it was surprising to me that she wasn't so much as the grandmother in a soap opera in the 90s or aughts. Like, I really was completely unfamiliar with her, and she had, to me, a more memorable performance in this movie. I mean, I haven't seen Coming Home since I was a teenager, but Jane Fonda, I think, has just so cemented herself also as a legend. By the time this movie comes around, like, she's well past Barbarella, so it's really, it's just kind of surprising that Jill Clayburgh just has this flash on the big screen in Hollywood, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Jane Fonda actually gets name dropped in An Unmarried Woman as like a contemporary woman on screen who the women in the group were all like, oh yeah, but they're not the same as the women we grew up with. And I think every generation feels that way, right? Or often does, like that, the women we grew, you have the nostalgia that kind of clouds your perception. And of course, like, obviously the women, Bette Davis and the Rita Hayworth, and those women had a different, like, cinema was different then, and women to be stars needed a different quality. So yes, there was something maybe more steely and more like, I don't know, just a different quality than what Jane Fonda brings to the screen.
Also an extremely controlled PR presence,
Yes.
Like, there were 100% gossip machines and stuff, but it was different than
Jane Fonda could do the AMC promo video where Heartbreak Feels Good in a Place Like This, but Nicole Kidman couldn't do Klute. That's what I'm getting from this conversation.
That would be I would not hate it as much if it was Jane Fonda doing it. Let's just say that.
This is a completely bonkers thing. I'm watching the show The First Lady on Showtime, and Gillian Anderson is playing Eleanor Roosevelt. It's strange. It's strange. But I was noting this because I watched both of these movies this weekend, that both of Eleanor Roosevelt's love interests are played by Donald Sutherland's son and Jill Clayburgh's daughter. So that was just kind of a random Venn diagram of things I was watching this weekend. But Lily Rabe is Jill Clayburgh's daughter, and she's a big TV actress now.
Did you notice that, or did you just find it in Googling?
I obviously know Kiefer Sutherland. I didn't know who, Lily Rabe is a name I knew, and then when I was researching Jill Clayburgh, and I was like, wait, I know that face. I've seen her being squirreled away in the White House hallways by Gillian Anderson in prosthetic teeth.
Oh my God. Speaking of bad accents, y'all know I have so much dislike for Nicole Kidman's American accent. I watched Dracula.
Which Dracula?
For the first time.
The
Bram Stoker's 1992 for Coppola. Yeah. Yo, I know this is completely off topic. This is bonus material, but holy shit.
We gotta talk about it in the bonus. I only just watched it for the first time myself, like a year ago, if that. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So, I just was thinking about Keanu Reeves in that movie where you're like, what was this casting? All right. Okay. 70s. We can stay on topic. It's fine. I feel like these are such fascinating, for all the reasons we talked about as indicative of a place to talk about the 70s. I feel like the probably the go-tos for 70s would be the Godfather and the Goodfellas. Was that 70s or was that 80s?
That was Goodfellas is early 90s.
Oh, fuck. Not that one. What's the other one I'm thinking of?
Well, so you might be, Scorsese's, probably go-to 70s film is Taxi Driver.
Yeah.
Those
feel like, sorry. It's not, obviously not Goodfellas. Those feel like when people talk about the 70s, that's what they go to, right? Of these gritty realism or whatever. And I think there's something really nice to be like, okay, but there's all this other shit that happened that was celebrated, right? Both of these films were nominated for Oscars and were considered amazing pieces of work at the time.
Yeah, and Carolyn, I was actually going to ask you, is it because you're a New Yorker now? Like, I think all 1970s movies are set in New York, except Chinatown, which isn't set in the 70s, which is why I feel like it makes sense that it's not New York. But I was like, oh, this was the only cinematic landscape I can think of. Like, Taxi Driver is a movie I've watched a few times, and it's like that feeling of New York that you get in all of these movies.
Mm-hmm.
I also feel like there's something interesting happening at the end of the 70s here, where you've got Jaws, you've got Alien, you've got Star Wars came out at the end of the 70s, and those feel like the 80s, right? Like, I think when we think about the well, I mean, I'm glad you mentioned that. It's interesting that you know, I talked, or I think early in the episode, about these directors, De Palma, Coppola, Scorsese, etc., wanting to like do something, kind of break away from the studio system, or do not break away from the studio system, but change the way it operated and do films that were very unlike what studio films had always done in terms of their commercial gloss and so on. But yes, you also have in that, friends with that same group, you have Spielberg and Lucas, and Spielberg in the 70s gives us Jaws. Lucas gives us Star Wars. So by the time the 70s are on their way out, the contemporary blockbuster has basically been born. I'd say Jaws is often considered the first like blockbuster in the modern sense of a film that just really dominates the cultural landscape in a huge way, which turned into, studio machinery that now really threatens the kinds of films that the directors who kind of define the 70s really want to make. I mean, so you have Scorsese now, like, he had to go to Netflix to get The Irishman funded because studios didn't want to fund like his lengthy, like 5,000 hour fucking goddamn. Yeah.
Also, I just wanted to note, because at first I felt like mildly uncomfy with the fact that these were maybe the best female character portrayals we were going to get were written and directed by men from this decade. But in An Unmarried Woman, the teenage daughter Patty does reference Lena Wertmuller. So it made me think, I was like, all right, we have Paul Mazursky is like clearly a fan of at least, the first woman who got the Best Director nomination at the Oscars, and the only one for a few decades.
I did want to mention Elaine May was sort of operating in the studio system and making some great films in the 70s. But yes, I mean, of course, sadly, like still tremendously, that whole landscape tremendously male dominated, obviously.
Yeah. I'm sorry, everybody. I don't know why you listen to me ever. Instead of Goodfellas, I meant Scarface, but that was also an 80s movie, so none of that even matters. I think I was just thinking of like De Palma energy feels like 70s kind of space. The other thing in the 70s that I'm thinking about, so and this is because I've been listening to You Must Remember This is miniseries about, or season about like erotica, like 80s erotica, like 70s going into the 80s. And like Last Tango in Paris, which is notoriously horrifying, is in the 70s, right? And I think that this period also starts that like really pushing the boundaries of like sex on screen and like seduction and like blurring lines between what's, porn and not, I guess, whatever, however you want to phrase that. Yeah, whatever. This is also when we're getting a lot of the horror stories about how directors are treating actors, specifically female actors and stuff. So that's just been kind of on my mind of like going through some of this time period, Yeah,
that's like a scene in Taxi Driver that I didn't really understand when I first watched it in, 2005 or something, when Travis takes his date to the porn theater. And she's offended and leaves. And I thought, like, I didn't even really have a concept of the porn theater in 2005. But that it was something that you could physically go to, but then also, it was almost shocking to see some of the the sex and sexuality in these movies.
Oh, absolutely.
Looking at how far we've come, Anita, you have certainly. We've talked about the Hays Code. That has been the thing. You didn't. That's why I was like, I'm going to bring it up. I promised
I wouldn't bring it up.
Spare you. No, but I didn't know. I thought the Hays Code ended in the in the 40s or something, but it ended in the 60s, I believe. So this really is such. Even in the 60s, we had so many more restrictions on what could be shown, and
well, and the Hays Code was replaced with the rating system that we know today, but that's gone through so many iterations. So the films that I'm talking about that were really kind of pushing boundaries, for better or for worse, X rating wasn't reserved just for porn, right? And so all these filmmakers were trying to get their movies rated R and not X that included really explicit sexual scenes, which is just not a reality of how the rating system works today, right? Or how we view it. And so it's really interesting to think about that evolution of pulling out of the Hays Code, the tension that was happening there. And then today it's just it's nothing. It's just, if you don't have a ridiculous, I just watched Mission Impossible today, and
the Brian De Palma one, the first one.
Yeah. And there's there's not even a sex scene in it. They just hold hands, and then it's insinuated that they fucked, and it was just really funny to me.
I was thinking about what's the television that's in the 70s? What are people actually consuming? And you have the most G-rated, the Partridge Family, the Brady Bunch and stuff going on, and then you can go to the movies and see Jane Fonda's descriptions of what kind of party you can have with her as a call girl. And now I feel you watch television to get Colin Firth eating Toni Collette's butt in the staircase, and then you go to the movies and it's Marvel, Avengers, who barely take their shirt off, and I'm it's completely flopped, flip-flopped.
I do think there's a we're in a weirdly sexless era of cinema. I think I guess Marvel that owes something to the proliferation of the Marvel blockbuster and the mainstream family friendly blockbuster. But yeah, I mean it's and I don't know, it's just
there's
weirdly...
there's a lot of skin, and there's not a lot of it's not sexy, it's paint by numbers kind of shit.
There's an amazing article or an opinion piece about this, and it's called, let me find the title really quick because it speaks exactly to what you just said, Anita.
While you're looking that up, I'm just gonna say that Dracula is extremely sexy. It
is
so
a very
surprised.
sexy movie,
right? But in relation to what we're talking about, of it surprised me how not I expected it to be really cheesy and over the top, and it just kind of worked. Whereas now, it's not.
Yeah, I mean, I love Fast and the Furious, okay? So, those movies are so erotic about cars and tech, But then, there might be a shot of, a girl in a short skirt where they're check those legs out. And then that's it. There's no, but it's that part of our collective audience experience has just been reserved for when you're watching television at home, you can enjoy this, but.
Well, and that's the thing about in the 80s, right, is that you get VHS. And so some of these movies that became, that were the word on the street was it's super sexy, it's this and that, holy shit, you're going to see what's his face's butt and thrusting or whatever. People started wanting to do that at home. Right. And so the movie business got the home movie business, even if a movie flopped in the theaters, people wanted to watch it at home privately.
Next season on Patreon, all the movies will be the 90s, sexy movies.
Yeah, we'll only do sexy movies. I love that.
The article that I was thinking of, it's called Everyone is Beautiful and No One is Horny. It's on a website called bloodknife.com. It's by R.S. Benedict. And I think it's a really thought-provoking read about the sexlessness of modern cinema. So
great.
I encourage folks to,
I definitely want to read that.
Look for that. Yeah.
Carolyn,
Yo.
We always love having you. Thank you so much. I know you said I'm not an expert, I'm just a fan, but fans know a lot and have very useful, interesting takes on stuff, and I love listening to you talk about movies. So thank you for doing this.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me. It was a real delight.
Is there anything you want to plug? Anywhere people can find you?
Just find me on Twitter at Carolyn Michelle.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for listening to Feminist Frequency Radio. Our show is engineered by Rob Para. Carrie Stimpson provides technical support. Artwork by Jamie Varon, and our intro music is by Phil Circus. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.